Welcome to The World Today, a program of Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs think tank. I'm Michael Horowitz, Interim Director of Perry Worldhouse and Professor of Political Science. Given the painful and challenging events of the last few weeks surrounding the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many more, as well as protests going on around the world and discussions about potential actions at the United Nations, we wanted to convene an event today to explore these issues and others. Today's guests are Dominique Day and Zeid Ra'ad Al-Hussein. Dominique Day is the vice chair of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a fact-finding body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate and report on the situation of people of African descent globally. She's a human rights attorney who also leads Daylight, an access to justice platform. She has a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a JD from Stanford Law School. So she's a real slacker in the education department. Zeid Ra'ad Al-Hussein is Perry Worldhouse Professor of Practice of Law and Human Rights and served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018. Prior to that, he served as Jordan's permanent representative to the United Nations. He was Jordan's ambassador to the United States and represented Jordan before the International Court of Justice. He has a BA from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. And he was previously a distinguished global leader in residence at Perry Worldhouse. Dominique and Zeid, thank you both so much for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse to have this very important conversation. And I want to open the floor to both of you. First to Dominique, and then to Zeid to give a few minutes of opening remarks before having some questions. Dominique, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And you can give me a little wave if I start going on a little too long. So I do want to thank you, though, for this important conversation and for really leaning into this moment, because I think this is a space where there is work for all of us to do, and there is ways for all of us to use our voices. And, you know, when I think about the topic for today and the ways in which we think about race and justice, for people of African descent in the Americas and in the diaspora, our lives have been characterized by this very long history of struggle and of ingenuity. And if you look back at as far back as the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans, we see not only the overt exploitation of people's bodies and lands and resources, and the normalization of brutalization in that process, but also the ways in which constructions of identity, of citizenship, of race continue to influence our mindsets even today. And for us, for people of African descent, from the beginning, you've seen this necessity to navigate both risk and to pursue liberation as these two sort of balanced goals that really inform, I think, both the resilience and the survival that are really characteristic of Black folk today. We talk about Black love, we talk about Black joy, and I think that's where it all comes from. So maybe to focus in a little bit, we've seen this shifting strategies and shifting discourse in this regard, and internationalism has always been a major focus, even from the very beginning. And so we're obviously in a UN heavy space right now. I think people here know that in 1947, W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP issued maybe one of the most important and famous and certainly maybe the most early petition to the UN, asking the UN, the newly formed United Nations, to take on and offer some redress and some recognition for the situation of people of African descent in the United States. This was hotly opposed by the United States, by President Truman, and even Eleanor Roosevelt, who we revere as the architect of our human rights framework, took a pass on this one. Although she sat on the NAACP board, this wasn't an area where she chose to exert additional political will. And so the ways in which people of African descent have approached the UN have shifted over time. Today, right, we're looking at a whole different moment. We're looking at a lot of calls to defund the police, for abolition of the police, that are really grounded in a recognition that robust commitments to reform, consent decrees, trials, all sorts of oversight in the United States has actually systematized racism against people of African descent. And so again, we're seeing people appealing very compellingly both to UN bodies and to other bodies. As you said, I sit on the working group of experts of people of African descent. We've issued statements and in contact with civil society. At the same time, there is an urgent debate happening tomorrow afternoon in the Human Rights Council, specifically at the request of the African nations, and also at the request of civil society, to look at the systematic racism in the US, to connect it to the legacies of colonialism and enslavement, and to really engage in the discourse of what it means to be a voice in support of freedom and liberation for people of African descent. So all of that to say, we continue to see the struggle for people of African descent strongly characterized by ingenuity, by a commitment to the idea of struggle. And that is actually within the very identity of people of African descent in the diaspora and on the continent itself. So maybe that's a good place for me to leave it for now.
Zaid, over to you.
Well, having listened to Dominique, I mean, one would have to agree. It is an extraordinary moment because of the solidarity worldwide that has been expressed following the awful and dreadful killing of George Floyd. I mean, from Tokyo to Sydney to Lisbon to almost every capital had some expression of solidarity. And so two issues immediately come to mind. You know, if notwithstanding everything that has been achieved, the deficit that still remains in the US is still so great, where African Americans still feel vulnerable to a systemic form of racism that's so deeply entrenched in so many parts of the country, then would it not be reasonable to assume you go to the international community for help? Because the impression given is that there is no domestic answer to it that seems to solve the problem within a short and urgent span of time. And so it's very interesting in the course of today's discussion to look at what is it that one can draw from the international community. So today, there was no special session devoted to this issue at the Human Rights Council, but there was a report submitted by a group called the Intergovernmental Working Group on the effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action. And it gave us a sort of foretaste for what we could see tomorrow. There were expressions very much of solidarity, which I've just spoken about, that were in evidence from all parts of the world. But also we saw other issues creeping into the discussion, not related to the issue of race in the United States or the issue of Afro-descendants and the discrimination they face around the world. And so there is a concern, and I would have it, unless there are safeguards, that tomorrow's discussion balloons into a broader discussion. It's not that other issues are not material, because when we speak about human rights, we speak about vulnerable communities worldwide and what they're experiencing. But I think that this demands a specificity, and if that can be contained, then something positive can come out of this. I worry, if it can't be contained, that if you have other luggage, other crises also added to it, you emerge with something rather amorphous, and those who don't want to pay attention can easily deflect what it is that's coming from the outside. I also think that I know that Dominique may have a different opinion to this, but really ever since the Kerner Commission ended its work in 1968, following the riots in 25 cities across the US, most particularly in Newark and Detroit, there has been no equivalent commission to look at race. The task force President Obama put together on 21st century policing, produced, from what I understand, I haven't seen the written work, but it's produced outstanding results. But I wondered whether or not a commission still needs to be created in the US and formed in a way that there is no disputing about the fairness of it, and to have one look at these sorts of issues, the policing issues, but another look at the historical narrative, because I feel that here in the US, as someone who's not an American, but one feels that the historical narrative is not settled. It's far from settled, and that has to be settled. And of course, the National Museum on African American History does outstanding work, but how do you get it into the curriculum of every school throughout the country, such that you begin to untangle this sort of cultural attitude? And perhaps this is something we can discuss during the course of this morning's discussion. I already see Dominique smiling. She's going to attack me, Mike. You have to defend me somehow.
Well, let me. I would normally ask a question now, but given the look that Dominique just gave you, I would love to give her the opportunity to jump back in maybe on that point, and then I've got a couple questions lined up.
Thank you. Yes, and apparently I have no poker face, which is just disastrous to my extracurricular skills, I guess. No, I really appreciate your words in this analysis. I guess I would just maybe say a couple things. One of them being what we're seeing globally, just to your earliest point. It's not just solidarity. People are talking about the ways in which their local personal experiences relate and are unbelievably parallel and similar to what's happening to Black folk here in the United States. And so I think that's important when you see weeks of protests in London, and that ultimately it's grounded in the ways in which people experience anti-Black racism there. But then maybe more specifically to the point about the Kerner Commission and some of the instruments that are being used, you know, I think a lot of people have real question about whether the use and deployment of these instruments is actually going to make change, or whether, as we've seen in the past, it almost pacifies people. There's been a commission, they've issued a report, and now we're moving on. There hasn't been maybe another big national commission, but certainly there's been other things like the Malin Commission in New York City looked at corruption in New York City Police Department. And yet its recommendations remain unimplemented. And these spaces where we see the fact of a commission, the fact of an investigation, the fact of research absorbing social protest, absorbing social outrage, and deflecting the need for actual accountability, right? I think that's the balance we have to strike between the importance, the absolute importance of curriculum, of commissions, of using the legal and policy tools we have, and of actually using metrics that are grounded in outcomes, understanding that unless there is transparency and accountability grounded in how are people in the community experiencing these improvements, right? Unless we have that kind of outcome-driven assessment, a lot of our work may not be as useful as we would hope.
I mean, the interesting thing about the Kerner Commission, sorry, Mike.
No.
The interesting thing about the Kerner Commission is if you viewed it today, you know, here you had a bunch of white guys, you know, deciding on issues of race. I mean, right from the start, you'd say this is totally not representative of American society and they should all be thrown out. But the mere fact that in 1968, they put almost all the onus, if not all the onus, on racism and white supremacy sort of thing. I mean, it was not what I think many thought it was going to be, which is these are hoodlums in inner city areas and you blame them for the violence. No, the blame was on the very community that was represented in the commission. And it's an amazing thing, because I think you're absolutely right, Dominique. I mean, the commission produced this report and then it just seemingly didn't go anywhere, and the momentum was lost, and it looked like, well, we've done our job, tick the box, thank you very much, and we move on, and the situation remains rather the same. But I wonder whether this is slightly different, because what we are seeing is in many countries where, you know, for instance, in Switzerland, you do have quite a substantial Eritrean population, and their situation is not good. I mean, we know this firsthand for anyone who's lived in Switzerland. But there were so many Swiss who were demonstrating who probably never met an Eritrean in their life. And they just, I think that there's a moment here where we feel, if we are going to advance as humanity, these forms of sort of primal thinking need to be completely turned on their head, and we have to advance as a species, and enough of all of this. And so I think hopefully the energy is sufficient that we can go beyond just a tick the box type of thing, if that's what's envisaged, because I don't think anyone has any appetite for it. And so, you know, if Boris Johnson is thinking of forming a national commission to look at it, I would think, yes, I mean, storming the Bastille, you can see that it's not bureaucratic and it has some power to it, and you don't want the energy to be lost. But I think a decisive discussion on the historical narrative is needed in this country. And somehow then to be leveraged in federal action in the form of informing, arming governors, school boards to actually reflect the history in the way it needs to be reflected. And if we hit it on a number of different vectors, and the thing is, you know, the energy has to be led by the community itself. So here I think this is the key thing. It can't be hijacked by politicians or others who have their own agenda. And this is again slightly what I'm worried about you know, that this may happen in the context of the UN, which we have to be careful. One other point, I think, Dominique, both of us, we both agree that there are aspects to the US which are unique, sui generis, and what we see in the US as actually, we see it in so many countries, as you yourself have said. And so we know most countries don't really have a clue how to handle it because racism has existed for so long. But what can we learn from the little experiences that we see of countries moving forward to somehow leverage on that and come up with an algorithm that seems to work for everyone?
So that's actually the first question I was going to ask, because while we like to think of ourselves in the United States, Americans, you know, we think of ourselves as exceptional in good ways and bad ways. But the United States is not the only country in the world with a long history of racial injustice. What can we learn from the ways other countries have sought to remedy, you know, deep prejudices and the way that state structures of power, like the police, are used against you know, racial or ethnic minorities? What do Americans need to be looking to around the world to learn?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it may be that the lessons that need to be learned are actually lessons we may all need to learn together. I think a thing that's very notable is the difference of policing, of incarceration in countries that are largely homogeneous, both at the very high economic level, but even at the very low economic level. I often talk about the difference. I used to visit a lot of prisons in another life. And I remember visiting some prisons, the military prisons in Afghanistan. And I remember American advisors informing us, our delegation, that, you know, we're just having a lot of trouble with these Afghans. We're trying to get them to call the prisoner by his number, and they just keep telling us that the prisoner has a name. And that's a statement they were making with no self-reflection whatsoever, that the denial of dignity, the denial of humanity, which is a core feature of imprisonment and policing in America, is actually quite easily rejected in spaces that involve a lot more homogeneity and understanding that criminal acts don't necessarily require dehumanization or the stripping of somebody's dignity. And so I think the answer to your question is a couple of things. Number one, and then maybe also a bit of a response to the last point. Number one, there is actually analysis and expertise out there with respect to many countries. The working group, our working group, has made many country visits. We've looked at policing and racial profiling. We've made specific recommendations that are very much grounded within the local context after speaking with both civil society and government, and honestly, anybody who wants to talk to us while we're in the country. Right, so ultimately there is a lot of available information, including specific to certain countries. We've obviously done these visits in the US as well. But I think secondly, there is a lot to be said around the ways in which the differences in brutalization, the way that brutalization can be normalized, look very different in countries with large populations of people of African descent, large populations of ethnic minorities, versus largely homogeneous populations who seem to be seen by the state very differently.
Mm-hmm. I would join Dominique and just add two more points. One is that, and this is a proposal that the special rapporteur on the freedom of expression has raised recently in an article in Foreign Policy, David Kay. The suggestion to the US would be, and the US is traditionally a country that doesn't like to be audited externally on its human rights record, right? So, let us handle it, you stay out of it, international community. So David Kay was proposing in the article, isn't it high time that the US now ratify the outstanding human rights treaties, that it domesticates in its legislation, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then join the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And isn't it high time that the US go from having a Civil Rights Commission to having a National Human Rights Commission, which is what many countries have done. And then it opens itself up to further external scrutiny, which keeps the pressure on inside the country. And I think that's right. I think David is right. I think that what we'd have to look at, though, is from the international side, do you have robust enough structures to take the hits from the US when you go and have these sort of, the confrontations, which on human rights issues you have to have with every country. I mean, the US won't be privileged in that sense. It will be special rapporteurs, coming out with observations, sometimes very critical. It'll be requests for visits by various expert bodies. It'll be reviews and reports issued. And if the US were to open itself up to external auditing, it would be potentially a good thing. It's no guarantee that it's going to change it outright, but it will move the ball forward, especially if it works in tandem with a momentum within the country to deal with these issues of policing, brutality, discrimination, social and income inequalities, everything that we're familiar with. And that potentially could work.
I wonder if I could briefly just 1 second, because I absolutely agree with that, right? Obviously, we should have a national human rights institution. We should affirm and really uplift the international human rights framework as both a solution and a commitment, right? Especially given the amount of global leadership the US tries to exert at times. I would say this, though, the issue of police brutality in the United States didn't start with this cohort of incidents. It existed under Clinton, under Obama, under presidents we think of as being more receptive to human rights. And in fact, in some ways, it may have been a bigger problem in areas. And I think for us, as human rights advocates and as people who are very committed to these spaces, I think it's very important to recognize those things should happen, but that the US in particular has shown remarkable flexibility in avoiding accountability under human rights mechanisms, right? The International Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the US actually withdrew its representative and has chosen to leave the seat empty. The US has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. So while you would hope that recognition and reciprocity would have some force here, that's what we rely on a lot in international law, this moment, I think these are necessary prerequisites, but again, I think this moment demands more, including from the international community. And I think the ways in which these instruments themselves have been used to either anesthetize or systematize racism in some ways, that's actually something we need to be aware of in not just affirming these instruments, but then also figuring out how to deploy them in service to substantive outcome-driven justice or assessments of justice.
That is a perfect lead-in to exactly what I was going to ask next, which was about restorative justice. And what does restorative justice look like in this kind of situation in the United States? Maybe there are analogies of from abroad. And what does the human rights system offer us in terms of thinking about the prospects for restorative justice? How should we be thinking about it? Maybe we can go to Zaid and then Dominique.
I think beginning from I mean, if you take it from the starting point, whatever is done has to feel and be authentic. I mean, when we look at memorialization and an approach to reparations, an approach to contrition, to recognition of the suffering, enormous suffering of vulnerable communities, whether they be First Nations, whether they be Afro descendants, whether, you know, that whatever is done has to be authentic. And it reminds me of a discussion I had once with a former Australian Prime Minister who was telling me that he was going to go before Parliament to issue an apology to the Aboriginal population in his country. And he said the lawyers were all over the text. They were, you know, fine-tuning, and it becomes a very difficult process because you come up with a text that's turgid and heavy and filled with jargon, and it just doesn't seem convincing. And he said, no, he just took the thing, he said, I'm not going to say this. And he went and he spoke from the heart. And now Australia has enormous problems still in this area. We saw something about Rio Tinto enter a huge problem. I won't go into that. But the issue is whether there's an authenticity from the leadership to, you know, to do this problem, to sort this problem out. Then you have the historical narrative. You then have to think of restorative justice and reparations, and you have to think how you move forward from all of this. So it's all leverage to ensure non-repetition and a clear path forward on a settled narrative. Otherwise, it's all piecemeal. It's much easier, perhaps, to approach these issues in other countries because if you have a central government and you don't have a federal system, you can sort of streamline it and you can make it more efficient. But where every country, almost every country, has difficulty is to do it properly, to have a wide open reflection on the past that then is leveraged into a national curriculum. Practically no country seems to be doing it perfectly, not even Germany. Looking at the past with a clear eye as to what was, you know, something you can be proud about and something that we all should be ashamed about in our own cultures and own societies. And so here, out of this crisis, the US can actually show the rest of the world how it could be done and be done well if it decides to do this. Obviously, we would have to wait until the elections and then see the outcome of the elections here in the US. But it could be a huge opportunity for the US and for the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, I agree. There is an enormous opportunity here. And I think the chance to really step in and seize this moment as a moment for both national reconciliation and moving forward, I think many different parties and many different constituencies would welcome that, including folks who don't necessarily even fully understand racism, would welcome just the resolution of this ongoing issue that has plagued the American consciousness and really clouded who we can be as people. I will say this, you know, I think for a lot of Americans and a lot of Black Americans, when we talk about restorative justice, we are talking about reparations, and it should mean a lot more than a check, right? It's not necessarily about what was the value of my grandfather building the White House, but there's also this other space, right? What does it mean to Black Americans to walk around and see statues to their enslavers, to see the ways in which both their exploitation has been erased and their enslavement has been glorified using coded language and racial dog whistles. And so I think that conversation about truth and reconciliation and reparations is a much deeper conversation than people have necessarily acknowledged thus far. And there are different reparations plans out there. There's a CARICOM plan. There's certainly plans floating around the US. I think also though, you know, there's a challenge. There's a challenge in the US around just the American identity, right? This idea that as American, I'm an American, right? As Americans, we are self-made. We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We are individuals with fierce capacity. And the reality is, the ways in which most wealth was created in this country was not through individual ingenuity, but through instead the exploitation of opportunity. And that opportunity often came in the form of Black bodies and still does. So even that recognition is a massive shift in mindset that that hopefully might be starting to happen now, but that has to happen if you want to have a real conversation about reparations, a real conversation about restorative justice. I think you may know about this right before all the protests started. There was an incident here in New York in Central Park where a Black birder, his name was Christian Cooper, was the police were called on him by this woman, Amy Cooper, who didn't want to put her dog on a leash, right? And she sort of weaponized her whiteness and performed, really, truly performed fear to try to invoke a state response of violence and enforcement in that space. And in Central Park, an area that we already know is heavily associated with, the racist prosecution of the Central Park Five and their unjust incarceration. And for me, when I think about how grounded so much of our current issues are in the historical historical enslavement and the ways in which that's actually influenced our mindsets, the fact that they have the same last name is almost a brilliant opportunity to think about how clearly and fully the idea of being property, the idea of being owners, are embedded in this American psyche, that in reality, so many Black last names are the names of their former enslavers. So many white people know that the Black folk in their family with their names, they don't talk about them, but they know that they exist. And they get recharacterized on things like these DNA apps. So this reality, this mindset, which we see manifesting in many, many, many ways, is absolutely a key feature to navigate in thinking about restorative justice. It's not as though it's not after a war. It's not after, the end of apartheid or, Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, where you can say, like, now is a moment to pivot, because we've seen the normalization of racism in such profound and outspread ways in American society. Really pivoting towards truth and reconciliation and reparations actually requires a mindset reset that might be more profound in some ways. I don't want to say more, but it's certainly very profound and complex. So
was one question or notes, I think, building on your point that the U.S. doesn't have a central narrative about anti-Blackness. And the Central Park example that you gave also points out that this is not just a race issue, but a gender issue, and speaks and maybe can help us have a little bit of a conversation about the intersection between race and gender in the context of anti-Blackness. What is it that what are the starting points, I think, for learning and understanding on that front? Since certainly what discrimination what injustice looks like in this context is intersectional.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm trying to, Dominique's made me think about how in our everyday small worlds, you see so much compassion and kindness. I live in central Harlem. I take the subway from 125th Street every day, back and forth, all over the city, up to the Bronx, down to the southern tip of Manhattan. And you see on an everyday basis, people so kind to each other. An old lady walks in, people stand up to give them the seat. Someone who's got disabilities walks in, people are all offering their seats. Race and ethnicity matters little. Why does it always become a problem in countries when the authorities are involved? Because on an everyday, in our small worlds, we see things that work. People can be genuinely kind and compassionate to each other. But somehow when we involve the authorities, local, or at a broader level, it becomes complicated. And we see this sort of institutional, almost aggression on people. People denied employment opportunities, denied their basic rights, treated appallingly or mistreated. And it doesn't happen in our small world as often as one would imagine, given how pervasive. But try say that to, someone who's just jogging along and has a look at a house and then is confronted and shot. I mean, of course, that's why they become these pivotal moments of shock. And you think, how can it be? How can we see this? You know, and it's very despairing. There's something about us which is still so primitive and still so, our inability to escape fear is something that we have to confront. One of my predecessors used to say, and I used to quote him often, was that fear is a very bad advisor, and it often always produces the wrong result. And so somehow we have to leverage on the goodness that we see at community levels between people who don't have any power and yet treat each other much better than when you look at the power equations and the way people can be so easily abused by those who have and wield power. And I'm trying to sort of think, how then can we take the small and scale it up to make it the equation that is used at a national level. So I'm sorry, I went off on a small sort of mental digression, but it's all Dominique's fault for putting me into that mental space.
It's my fault, and I wanna push back a little bit because I think our experiences are so determined in some ways by our subjectivity. So I guess I would say, if you talk to a lot of my Black women friends who've been pregnant and been on the train, if you talk to me and other professionals, we could sit for days and talk about racial microaggressions. My Black women friends would say, I'm 9 months pregnant on the train and I had to literally start yelling for someone to get up and give me a seat. So I think these experiences...
I've never experienced it. Doesn't mean that it doesn't.
No, I understand that. I fully understand that. And I'm assuming you might notice, right? If you had, but I guess what I'm suggesting is you also might not, right? Like the ways in which microaggressions occur and the ways in which we have learned to triangulate around them, right? Something happens, I walk into the courtroom, which has happened to me on more than one occasion, and the judge thinks I'm the defendant, right? Even though I'm wearing a suit, even though I walk into the well of the courtroom, even though I have my computer, all of which you can't do if you're a client, right? Am I going to do more than just say judge, or am I going to make it a big thing, right? Because confronting the amount of racism I might experience, especially in these microaggressions, that could be a full-time job for me. So I think on some level, a lot of racial microaggressions are not necessarily apparent to folk who are not experiencing them or who haven't experienced them personally. But I'll tell you, every single Black attorney I know, and especially all the men, have had that experience in court. Every Black woman I know in New York City has talked about being 9 months pregnant and giving people a death stare on the subway to try to get someone to give her them a seat. And so, I do think in a court, and to be honest, not all, half the people sitting down are not white people, right? So the ways in which our bodies are seen as valuable, to be respected, to be given equal dignity, often we experience it quite differently. But then at the same time, to protect our own sanity and to protect our own resilience, we don't necessarily engage in areas that we don't see strategic value. And I think that plays into this question about intersectionality, which is a lot of our other commitments, right? My commitment as a woman, my commitment as a lesbian, right? These commitments are intersectional commitments. And now at no point am I abandoning my race in construing my other identities. But I will say, right, that there is a massive debate around the way intersectional feminism may actually be harmed by other liberal feminism or more white forms of feminism. And situations like Amy Cooper, who is seizing her power, right? I can't explain that situation. I don't know why she was doing it, but it's horrible. She's maybe not the best
She
person,
should
right?
have just had the dog on a leash. That's
Right, but she's mobilizing her power in that situation.
right.
On some level, that's a feminist act, but it's also a profoundly racist act. And it reflects back to this idea, right? You had, for white women, this was a way for them, getting slaves was a way to have property. So some of the greatest wealth you see among white women historically was wealth in enslaved people, wealth in Black bodies. And so the idea that being against patriarchy can also, right, like mobilizing your power within patriarchy may involve overtly racist acts is not new or unfamiliar. And that's another mindset that might require some unraveling. But this, I'll say one other intersectional point here around folks like Breonna Taylor, right? The space where you've seen Kim Crenshaw and others talk about, the say her name, because some of the most profound and horrific violence, but then also inexplicable tragedy is happening to Black women, and it's somehow less noticed. Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old EMT shot in her bed as a result of a no-knock warrant that appears to be like massively suspect. We had Sandra Bland, right, who dies in police custody after a police stop for apparently nothing, right? And so the violence that we're talking about on Black bodies is also occurring in interesting and non-standard ways to Black women's bodies as well. And that is actually really consistent with the experience a lot of people have day to day. I will agree with you on this one though. There is amazing and unexpected kindness and compassion in the world. I can tell you in this moment where a lot of us are struggling to do, to be in this moment in as helpful way as possible and to be of service. We're relying on so much kindness that is actually supporting us and uplifting us. But there's even been some interesting analysis in this moment where a lot of New York is still under quarantine at how many Black people are actually finding their anxiety has gone down from just not navigating the everyday racism of the city. And I can't say that I don't understand that.
So I want to pivot slightly. I mean, that answer was incredible, by the way, but I want to pivot slightly to ask about something that gets into the where do we go from here sort of piece of this. I mean, we're at about 12:45. We've got 15 minutes left, and several people in the Q&A have asked variations on what about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We talked a little bit about previous commission efforts in the United States and some of the downsides of those. What obstacles might would such an effort be a good idea in theory? What might obstacles to some sort of truth and reconciliation process, what might those obstacles look like, and how would one set it up? I mean, in the United States is used to telling other people about the reconciliation they need to do. As I think Zaid or you, Dominique, had mentioned earlier, we're a lot less good at accepting our own work. So, do we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the U.S.?
I mean, I would say yes. I mean, I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm always in favor of commissions and analysis and instruments. And then I want to talk about implementation and accountability, right? I do think there is room to have a deep and thorough investigation that then offers an instrument to advocates for change and offers an instrument to government, right, in one place and well analyzed. I think what the U.S. has that some other countries don't have. I mean, it is unfortunate we're sort of focusing on the U.S. because this is a really global moment. But what the U.S. has that other countries don't have is we do have a massive amount of disaggregated data. We do have multiple decades of attempts at reform in judicial, legislative, and executive spaces at local and federal spaces. And what that has accomplished, and more importantly, perhaps what it has not accomplished, should inform any attempts at truth and reconciliation, right? What a solution looks like has to acknowledge the solutions that have not necessarily solved the problem. And I think the fact that we have, 5 years of a consent decree against the NYPD, and yet you see them beating unarmed and peaceful protesters in the streets a couple weeks ago, that says a lot about what that remediation process has been able to do. So I think what's beautiful about the US in its abject failure to really confront and redress systemic racism, what's beautiful is that there's a massive amount of data, information, and analysis that could inform a real effort at both examining and charting a course forward on systemic racism in this kind of a way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the way in which the Truth and Reconciliation would be cast would be important. I wouldn't necessarily call it that because there's so many models which it would immediately bring to mind. I think the US has to have its own, shape its own model that fits its own history. And it would probably be a hybrid model of what the South African government did, in that it had and most people don't know of the Desmond Tutu Historical Commission that was, that worked alongside the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the South African context. I would imagine that something that combines the two and has a sort of historical but also legal sort of aspect to it would be something that would work. And speaking to Dominique's point, the wealth of information, the amount of information available in the Library of Congress, in the National Museum on African American culture. I mean, there's so much that you can bring into this and make it and it's not a sort of commission in the US sense where you have a group of people who go hide somewhere and they put together a report and it's submitted and then a few op-eds and it dies. But a commission where you have open hearings and there is attention given to it and then it binds the country together in the need to settle the narrative and to do justice to a very clear population. I think the more interesting thing is, and this is something, Dominique, I would also, I'm not an American, so it needs the opinion of Americans, but whether or not it's just the African American community or the other recognized communities that have been long subject to the systemic discrimination by white Americans or the Americans who are of European descent. So of course, First Nations, the Chinese, Mexican, and Japanese American communities that also have suffered long-term structural discrimination in the States. But this is something for Americans to discuss and Americans to debate. But out of all of this, I just think the US cannot go through another 2 or 3 decades of this. It has to end. And the US can lead the rest of the world in showing how one can do it. And that's why I think you look at it in terms of the opportunities that it brings. And I would nominate Dominique to be the head of the commission.
Dominique, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the question about what is the appropriate scope of racism is an important one to just talk about here for a second. And I think all racism is not equal. It's not right. And it means something to have been in this country before there was a country, to have built a country, and yet to still walk down the street and have white people ask if they can touch my hair, and to ask, one day somebody asked me if when my skin peels off, if it peels brown or it peels white like theirs, right? And so ultimately, just the othering, the lack of understanding, the lack of engagement, the ways in which some folk have managed to create a life with so little racial difference, I think is really relevant here, specifically for people of African descent who've been in this country, who've been part of this country from the very beginning. And so when we talk about anti-Black racism, we talk about it differently from other forms of, also very important to redress racism against other groups. But I don't actually think you can talk about the historical narrative that we've been discussing here today without a pretty singular focus on people of African descent.
I think, but to make it successful, you probably want to, certainly at the tip of the whole process, you focus on this. And then as you're developing a sort of solutions to these, then it's sort of, you see whether you can apply it to everyone else, because you need to solve the problem broadly, but you clearly this has a specificity to it, and the moment is focused on it, and that's right. Yeah, I agree.
So both of your answers suggest that there is something that a country like the United States or another country could do, but there's an interesting question in the Q&A that wonders is it too late that people of color, according to the questioner, built this country, but the country was not built with them, written with them, or for them in mind. Is America too broken? And how do we think about addressing that? And are there lessons here from other countries? Another person in the Q&A brought up South Africa. And are there lessons from other countries that might help us get at how to address a situation where you have people in the United States that think reform isn't even possible?
Well, I think there's a difference between reform and repair, right? And the United States is desperately in need of repair. When I was a kid, I used to be grounded all the time for literally nothing. And one of the things I got grounded for once was my father and I were arguing about Biko versus Mandela. At the time, Biko was dead and Mandela was in prison, and arguing about which strategies were better and which strategies were more effective. And of course, in order to prove his power, I was arguing on the Biko side. I got grounded to prove that, power will out. And of course, fast forward some years later, and you see remarkable transformation that nobody could have acknowledged or predicted. And for all the ways people love to denigrate South Africa these days, South Africa is an amazing miracle of modern international growth and change and repair. And if you've been there, it's like a place you could just fall in love and stay, right? And so I don't think it's too late. I am a person, again, grounded in struggle, grew up in struggle, who believes that you fight every battle in front of you as hard as you can with the tools that you have. And our country is broken. It's absolutely broken in profound ways, and nobody knows that better than Black folk. But at the same time, we understand what's possible. We're still here. We're still investing, right? Like I don't know that people of African descent in any country, not just the United States, are looking to leave, right? We're actually looking to be recognized for the ways that we contribute and to be thought of as part of a national identity. And I guess I've abandoned my UN role at this moment, but I don't actually believe any space is too broken or too far gone to be repaired. You may have to repair it by tearing it all the way down to the ground and building it back up, and that's the conversation happening around policing right now, right? But that's not national identity. Our national identity can actually evolve to embrace the complexity and the truths of who we are as Americans. Yeah. I think also, as in my capacity in the working group, I would also say that, but I've obviously now taken on a very personal approach.
If you added who we are as Americans and green card holders, then you could include me. You could include
no, 100%. Because it does, right? Like a nation of immigrants that is struggling so hard to really adopt how immigration has built this country is really a stunning moment in the U.S. I mean, that's not really what we're talking about today, but it's fascinating how our national narrative around immigration is also somehow being perverted at this moment.
Yeah,
but yeah, 100%.
Isn't there a T-shirt that is very popular that says "Made by Immigrants"? Basically, Dominique, I couldn't say it better. Absolutely, she spoke for me in answering your question, Mike.
So let me ask one more question, and then I know we're on I know we need to wrap up since you both have other things that you're doing today, and wondering a bit about what we could do at the local level. So Perry World House is part of the University of Pennsylvania, which is based in West Philadelphia, a place that has had a questionable, in Pennsylvania, UPenn's had a questionable relationship with the neighborhood. Some upsides, some downsides, and as we all think at the local level, as well as thinking about the national level, international, human rights, et cetera, how should we be thinking about what individuals can do to support racial justice work locally?
So I think actually that's the most important question there is. When we talk about institutional racism, right, we're talking about these policies and practices that operate almost automatically, but they're enforced by people with small amounts of power in these very local ways. So in Philly, for example, there's a group called Black Doctors COVID, which is a group of Black doctors. One of them's a college classmate of mine who started going out into the community to both defeat the rumors around COVID, but then also to really address the biases they were seeing in both medical care and in the diagnosis and taking seriously of Black claims of illness and pain, right? We knew there was research, right? There's been research that says that doctors routinely underestimate Black pain, routinely underestimate Black claims of illness. And these doctors who started seeing it in COVID immediately leaned in and created this organization. And in fact, even created a checklist so that people could go to their doctors and do better in terms of outcomes that could save their lives and save the lives of their families. So I think the local engagements are incredibly important because it also is where it can be effective. It also tells you, here's a space in my community where I can talk to somebody one-on-one and really change a thing that's impacting me day to day, right? I can go to my principal and say, why is it that all of the Black kids are being moved into lower level education? Why, right? Like these spaces are incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, Mike. A lot of the students that I've worked with, very gifted students, and mainly from the law faculty, spend a great deal of time pro bono working with the community. But institutionally, it is true that, we at Penn, we have all these high-powered meetings, we're reviewing papers, we're involved in research work. And maybe we do need to sort of at times just break off and go into the community and sit, especially with kids. And so we're not sort of stuck in our own world of abstraction and high theory, but we learn from them and we make ourselves more accessible to them. It's true that at certain moments you just have to stop and think, okay, I'm doing all of this, but could I do more with the community that's within a half-mile radius around the campus? And I know the students are doing it, but they're doing it almost as volunteers. Perhaps we need to think more institutionally about doing more. I like the idea.
Let me also add there, though, as long as you're talking about what Penn could do, I think it's also important that we see representation and expertise of people of African descent in the leadership and at the elite levels. So when we talk about things like faculty diversity, we talk about the ways in which research is funded, the ways in which policies, Penn, you had these amazing policy institutes, the ways in which these are created. The lack of proportionate Black representation in these spaces equals a lack of expertise, equals a lack of attention to these issues. It's only since we've had more Black PhDs that we've started to see this research that's showing very dramatic racial disparities almost everywhere we look for them. So that's a deficit that's completely grounded in the way the academy itself perpetuates its own whiteness.
So we've got about 45 seconds left, and I would like each of you in 15 seconds to answer the following very simple question. Are you optimistic about where we're headed on these issues?
Yes, optimistic. And just on Dominique's last point, there's a great piece in the New York Times by Chris LeBron, who is an academic at my alma mater, Johns Hopkins, who speaks exactly to the point that Dominique has raised. And I urge people to read his piece in the New York Times. Chris LeBron, really good.
I am also optimistic. I may have mentioned to you, I think this millennial generation, which has been vilified by Generation X and above, has stepped into its power and into its identity, and they are changing the world, and they're going to lead us.
As a Gen Xer, it pains me to be anything but cynical, but this has been an inspiring conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope the over 200 people that have been in the audience for this event have learned a lot as well. So thank you to Dominique and to Zaid for joining us. We really appreciated hearing your insights.
Thank you.
And we hope you'll all join us next week for our event on the race for a cure to coronavirus, featuring Susan Weiss, a Penn researcher working on a COVID vaccine.
Thank you. Superb.
Thank you so much,
Mike.
really.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.